Hi everyone, this is Dr. Joseph Hammer. I'm a counseling psychology program faculty member in the Department of Educational School and Counseling Psychology at the University of Kentucky. And in today's podcast, I wanted to introduce listeners to the Hammer Lab. And what HAMMER stands for is Help Seeking and Multicultural Measurement Evaluation Research. So it's the HAMMER Lab, most fittingly. And as you've probably discerned from the information on my website, the HAMMER Lab is focused on what helps or stops people who are struggling with a mental health concern like anxiety or depression, or a physical health concern like diabetes or cancer, seek or not seek help from a proper health professional. There can be a variety of facilitators and barriers to seeking help in terms of material barriers like insurance and transportation, psychosocial barriers such as stigma and social pressure, and contextual factors such as cultural group influences, racial ethnic background, immigration status, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and such. So the research we do in the HAMMER Lab is focused on understanding the help-seeking process for various conditions, as well as a focus on how we go about measuring these constructs or concepts, such as the stigma of mental illness or help-seeking attitudes. It can be a lot harder than you might think to reliably and validly measure constructs like these. And so one of the things that our lab specializes in is evaluating our current attempts to measure these constructs and exploring new, better ways of capturing these things so that the future research we do on help seeking is more accurate and a valid reflection of reality. Because if we're trying to capture a construct like the self-stigma of seeking help, and we think we're measuring it correctly, but we're actually not, that can lead to wrong and misleading measurement, which can produce biased or flawed findings, which can itself be quite dangerous because every day psychologists and other mental health professionals, as well as policymakers, make clinical and policy decisions based on results from instruments like these. So it's really important to make sure we're actually measuring what we think we're measuring and doing it properly. So that's another aspect of the HAMMER Lab, and that's where the multicultural measurement evaluation portion of the acronym comes into play. I want to take some time to describe how the HAMMER Lab is structured and how the people who are members of the lab work as a team to conduct the research that we do. There are 4 kinds of members of the lab. Heading the lab is myself and a graduate student lab coordinator. Typically, this coordinator is a doctoral student, a PhD in counseling psychology student, who is one of my current advisees. So between myself and the lab manager, we seek to help the lab run smoothly and coordinate all of the varying responsibilities and workload for our various projects. Working with us are counseling psychology PhD students in the University of Kentucky program who are interested in collaborating with fellow students and faculty members like myself on help-seeking and multicultural measurement evaluation research. In addition to these students, we also have a master's program in counseling psychology, as well as master's programs in school and educational psychology. So we will have master students from these three programs contribute to the lab, and I should mention sometimes we also have PhD students from school and counseling psychology, in addition to the counseling psychology PhD students who contribute as members of the lab. And then finally, we have undergraduate students from the University of Kentucky. Most often, these students serve as research assistants, undergrad research assistants, who we refer to as RAs for short. And oftentimes, these students are majoring or minoring in psychology from the psychology department in the College of LAS on campus. However, we sometimes also work with undergraduate RAs who hail from other colleges and other programs on campus, as long as the students have an interest in developing their skill sets around social scientific research from a psychological lens. The lab can be a good fit for these students. So in summary, we have undergraduate RAs, master's and doctoral students in psychology, particularly counseling psych typically, and then myself leading the lab. I often collaborate with fellow counseling psychology faculty members at UK as well as other institutions in the country, and so they can kind of be considered guest members of the lab in a way. So the Hammer Lab is made up of a diverse set of professionals who are at various levels of their educational training, and the types of tasks and projects that each of these groups of students or professionals take on is very much dictated by a few key things. The first thing is what subtopics related to help-seeking and or multicultural measurement evaluation that are of most interest to those persons. Something that I've found personally in doing research is that I do my best work and I'm most passionate about pouring my time into a given project when I find the topic and the project interesting and important. So members of the Hammer Lab seek to work on projects that speak to them and feel important to them. In addition to working on projects that tie in with their interests, lab members at each level of educational development are always seeking to develop further and deepen particular skill sets related to the research process. So as a faculty member who heads up the lab, I'm always learning a variety of new techniques and paradigms and methods of conducting research. And I train those I work with on these new methods so that they can then pass down this knowledge to the other folks who are working with them in the lab. Because I have the most professional experience in doing research, I tend to spend my time tackling some of the most complex portions of the research cycle for the various projects and play a key role in helping to delegate the various tasks that are associated with a given research project. So because I know what it takes to see a project through from initial conceptualization to publication in a peer-reviewed journal, I work with my collaborators in the lab to figure out who can take on what pieces of the project, how to divvy up that work, how to work as a team, and how to coordinate everything so that we have a constant flow of several studies going on at any given time. The Hammer Lab coordinator also plays a pivotal role in delegating and keeping organized the various projects that members of the lab are working on. This person is sort of my right-hand man or woman or person. In turn, the doctoral students, the PhD students in the lab, take on variety of tasks related to our current projects, and typically more advanced tasks that require a considerable degree of independence and autonomy and self-sufficiency and the ability to motivate oneself, figure out what the task involves and what pieces don't make sense and that require consultation either by talking with me or the lab coordinator or by consulting the research literature directly to figure out what must be done. So these typical tasks at this level can be reviewing published literature to identify what has and has not been studied about a given topic, writing down a literature review of what has been found about a given construct, managing the data collection, the online survey data collection for a given study, drafting, or meaning writing, a given section of a research manuscript, such as creating a rough draft of the introduction section or creating the method section or attempting to write up the results section, for example. Creating and submitting institutional review board applications and modifications for studies that we've decided we want to do. Doing basic or advanced analyses of data sets or cleaning those data sets and looking at assumptions statistically and whether or not they're met, such as normality or heteroscedasticity. Wow, that's hard for me to say still, man. Heteroscedasticity. There we go. Whew. That's what 10 years of graduate school gets me. Skewness and kurtosis, and whether correlations between key variables are linear or non-linear. So those sorts of preliminary data screening sorts of tasks as well. And of course, these doctoral students vary from being in their first year in the program to currently being on pre-doctoral internship. And so over the course of their training, through classwork and working on projects with faculty members and each other, they gain a stronger and stronger skill set and knowledge of certain research literatures. And so the responsibility and workload that they take on increases proportionally with their experience and time in the program, ideally. And in fact, these students are required as a part of our program to take the lead on research, particularly for their dissertation towards the end of their time in the program, where they have to conceptualize, create, conduct, and write up a study that's all their own. And they must extensively document the entire experience for the world to see. So depending on
what level a given doctoral student is at in terms of their research acumen and experience, they'll be taking on different tasks and portions of the projects in the Hammer Lab. And next up we have the master's students in counseling psychology, school or educational psychology sometimes as well. And these students are in our 2-year program. And if they're involved in the Hammer Lab, this by definition means that they find the research we do of interest and they're inclined towards being involved in the research side of psychology. Because, of course, students getting their master's degrees, some folks want to go a purely clinical route, some want to go teach, some would like to conduct research, and some are exploring to figure out exactly what they might want to do going forward as a professional. So we'll have master's students who are involved in the lab who are, for example, interested in research, wanting to further develop and polish their curriculum vitas to make themselves stronger and stronger candidates for getting into a PhD or a PsyD program in counseling or perhaps clinical or school or educational psychology. And so they are taking on tasks that match their level of experience, interest, and initiative. So sometimes master's students are doing similar caliber work as doctoral students, particularly if they had the opportunity as undergraduate students to be heavily involved in research or perhaps to do a capstone project or a senior thesis or other advanced thing where they took on a lot of independent work related to the project, while some other master's students really had very little experience as undergraduate students in terms of the research process. And so their work in the lab is very similar to the work that some of the undergraduates and the undergraduate RAs in our lab are doing, because they're still fairly new to the process and are wanting to learn some of the basic and foundational research skills that are needed to succeed in this area. And then finally, we employ undergraduate RAs who typically are juniors and seniors at UK, because it's usually harder to get involved in research and contribute meaningfully to it when you're really new to college and still getting your feet wet and taking classes and learning some of the basics in your classes so that you'll be ready to contribute to a research lab. But there's sometimes precocious or advanced sophomores or maybe even freshmen who are looking to get involved in research labs who might work in the Hammer Lab. And so these undergraduate RA students will oftentimes take on some of the simpler and easier to delegate tasks that match their current developmental level and their research experience, which is usually more basic as someone who's just starting to get their hands dirty with the research process. So these tasks can vary widely depending on what kind of psychology research lab you're in. And because I'm talking about the Hammer Lab in particular, I will speak to some of the typical tasks that undergraduate RAs have done on behalf of the Hammer Lab. And if you're listening to this and you are a prospective undergraduate RA who might be interested in working with us in the lab and gaining valuable experience as well as strengthening your CV for graduate school, then what I have to share about the typical tasks that you might be involved in as a part of the lab, I think should be of particular use to you. One of the most common tasks that undergraduate RAs will help out with is finding and retrieving PDFs of published peer-reviewed articles on behalf of the folks working on projects in the lab. So to do this, whoever they are working with in the context of lab projects will provide the RA with, say, a list of article titles, or maybe an entire citation, or maybe just say, hey, find everything that Patrick Corrigan published in 2005 on stigma of mental illness, for example. And these students will take whatever leads are provided and they will hunt down using usually Google Scholar and or PsycInfo, which is like a Google for research articles specific to the social sciences and psychology. And they will find the full text of these articles and download them as PDF. They will then pass these PDFs back to the folks they're working with in the lab. And sometimes not only will they obtain these PDFs, but they'll also organize them into a sensible folder structure to group the articles by theme, because we're often building a robust collection of help-seeking and multicultural measurement studies, PDFs of those studies, and it's important to keep the hundreds and hundreds of articles organized and filed in a sensible way that makes them easier for us to find later or search for when we're so inclined, because we have a shared PDF article collection that makes it easy for us to figure out what sort of research has already been done and check out how people studied various things and what gaps in the literature still exist. So building these databases of article PDFs is pretty key to our success in the lab. So in addition to finding articles and retrieving them and perhaps organizing them, sometimes RAs will be asked to take it a step further and to create short summaries of these articles, such as in the form of an annotated bibliography, where an RA will write a paragraph touching on key aspects of the study and placing that in a Word document for the use of whoever they're collaborating with in the lab. Those RAs who have mastered these more basic aspects and are interested and willing and excited to take on more advanced tasks, a common more advanced task will be summarizing key aspects of several articles on a given topic. So perhaps creating what I call a research synthesis, where an RA is tasked with reading a variety of papers, say on mental health stigma or mental health literacy, and summarizing, okay, how is this thing measured? What variables has this construct been found to correlate with? What do we know about the construct, and what do we not yet know? And what are some ideas for future studies related to this construct that have been discussed in these articles? So depending on the needs of the research team members, the RAs can synthesize across several articles key information about prior research. So that's a more advanced task, almost like, in a way, writing a literature review on a given topic, which is something that goes into the introduction section of any typical article, empirical article you write for a journal when doing research. So that's a more advanced task that can look really good on your curriculum vitae when, say, you're applying to graduate school. In addition to tasks like these, RAs who have worked with me have also
helped myself and other members of the Hammer Lab to recruit participants for the various survey studies that we do throughout the year. So sometimes we're trying to collect what's called a convenient sample of individuals from a given population, such as a university student population. And in order to obtain these participants who will then participate in our study, our RAs will help find and get the informed consent of individuals who might participate so that we can increase the sample size for a given project and invite enough people to participate that we're then able to validly measure the results of the project and that we have enough statistical power to look at relationships or detect possible group differences. So recruitment of participants either in person on campus or by emailing various websites related to the study topic and asking the moderators of those websites or members of those websites if they'd be interested in participating, spreading the word about studies on social media and other digital venues, basically exploring various appropriate channels to help spread the word about a given study and bring in lots of participants so that we can then examine what we're wanting to examine. Sometimes undergraduate RAs who've had a little bit of experience with the lab and are ready for something more challenging, they'll be provided with a list of the items that need to be coded into an online survey. We use a program called Qualtrics where you can create online surveys using it. So some RAs become familiar with how to use that platform, and after we get IRB approval for a given study, they will create that survey within Qualtrics and ready it for data collection. Some RAs might even have as their task monitoring the data collection on a given study and watching how the participants are flowing in, and when we have enough participants or we need to increase our data recruitment efforts or whatnot. Sometimes when members of the lab are meeting to conceptualize and think up new studies, undergraduates will contribute ideas based on their own experience and the articles they may have read related to help seeking and multicultural measurement. And so they will help us brainstorm new projects and angles on certain topics that haven't yet been explored, which is a lot of fun. Another thing that RAs have helped with in the past is helping us create and evaluate new items for new self-report instruments that we develop to measure various things like help-seeking attitudes or stigma. And so they might generate possible items and submit them to me, or I might provide them with a list of items and they will give me feedback on how clear, comprehensible, or confusing the instructions for the scale are, as well as individual items. Or they'll rate them on clarity and other indices of quality so that we can then be sure to tweak the instructions for the instrument to make it maximally clear and help include or exclude certain items that might be problematic for the instrument. So that help is really valuable. They might also participate in many focus groups to help us think about how to go about measuring this construct or how to generate items for an instrument. They might also, once we've created a survey and we're about to go live with it and start collecting participants, we might first have our RAs look over that survey in a proofreading sort of way to make sure the logical flow of the instrument works and we've avoided typos and it's just rock solid and ready for participants. Sometimes when it comes to
analyzing studies that have been published in the past. Sometimes I'll be, or one of my lab members will be trying to write up the findings of a new study, but to provide context for our results, we'll have to look at past literature to see, for example, how correlated two constructs have been shown to be in past studies. And so we might give an undergraduate RA the task of searching through the relevant past articles to figure out what the effect size was for a given analysis, or what kind of samples were collected in past studies on this topic, or other sorts of more concrete questions that we need to figure out in order to properly write up our studies. So they will treasure hunt for those things, recording their findings or results in, say, Microsoft Excel spreadsheet as they go to keep things organized. That can often be a really valuable resource, such that we're able to look at in a very concise manner what's been published in the past in terms of key correlations or the reliability of a certain instrument across various studies, things like that. In addition, once a manuscript, once a paper has been rough drafted or final drafted, and we're thinking about submitting it to a certain peer-reviewed journal for consideration for publication, we'll often ask our research assistants to proofread the paper and read through it and see if it makes sense and has good grammatical and logical flow. Does it avoid errors? Does it conform with APA style? They might help clean up the in-text citations or create or polish a reference list for that article, and just helping us catch anything that's not perfectly polished that should be caught before we send it in for formal peer review consideration. So those are some of the typical tasks that the undergraduate research assistants in the Hammer Lab might help with on a week-to-week basis. So, having described the 4 levels of professionals involved in the lab and the various kinds and complexities of tasks that folks at each level tend to take on, I will now describe some of the research-related tasks that might happen in other research labs on campus, but that are not part of the experience that folks would get as a part of my lab. Because again, depending on what you want to do career-wise, what you want to study, whether you're interested in clinical or counseling psychology or social and personality or industrial organizational psychology or social work or nursing or whatever it is, different labs use different methods and paradigms and research team setups to investigate given questions related to health and well-being. So because of that, as you cultivate a sense of what you want to do and what kind of research methods you want to get exposure to, then you can increasingly start to seek out research lab experiences where you will develop those skills. So it's always good to the degree you can, figure that piece out. So for example, if you know you want to get exposure to certain kind of skills that you don't have, the Hammer Lab may or may not be a good fit. So if you envision yourself potentially doing help-seeking research or more broadly doing social science survey-based research, then the Hammer Lab is probably a good fit because that's our bread and butter. That's what we do a lot of. If you're instead wanting to, say, go into social psychology and you envision yourself answering questions by doing lab-based experiments where you physically bring participants into a research lab and then have them run through a protocol where they're exposed to certain stimuli or events, and then their reactions are watched. And um, undergraduate RAs put on the white lab coats and they walk each participant through the protocol. Okay, do this thing, now complete this, now come over here and sit here, that sort of thing. Um, that will happen in certain social psychology or cognitive psychology labs on campus. But that will not happen in the context of the Hammer Lab because I do primarily survey research rather than experimental research. So if you're looking to uh, be running participants through a protocol and you envision your sort of research in the future relying on that heavily, and you want that experience, then you'll want to seek out a different lab on campus that would offer that. That tends to be a pretty common thing in my experience that can be found in a lot of the labs in the psych department on campus. Um, Likewise, if you want to gain experience analyzing transcripts of focus groups and interviews and coding them for themes and other forms of qualitative based research, as opposed to quantitative statistical analysis of data, qualitative data is a less common data that I work with in the Hammer Lab, and I tend not to do qualitative studies as that's a skill set that I did not make time to develop so far in my professional career, whereas other professionals such as Dr. Candace Crowell tend to do a lot of qualitative research that involves working and analyzing that rich text data to answer certain research questions. So if that's a set of research skills you were really wanting, then again, the Hammer Lab would not be the place where you would go to acquire those skills. Likewise, if you're wanting to get experience with running fMRI machines or EKG machines and other physiological psychology sorts of data analytic approaches and experimental protocols, the Hammer Lab is not typically a place where that sort of research occurs. And one thing that I should mention that in my experience, a large number of RAs tend to do on behalf of their labs is, and maybe this is getting less common as things become more electronic, but historically, a lot of times surveys and research protocols would use a lot of paper, and so they would get data recorded on paper surveys, and then you'd need somebody to type all those numbers, those answers, up into an Excel file or an SPSS document so that it could then be analyzed properly. And that work typically falls to the undergraduate research assistants working with that lab. I know I had stints when I was an undergraduate at University of Illinois where I was just entering data into an Excel file for hours and hours. And it's good to have a little bit of that experience to get a sense for what that's like and to get to know database entering and management techniques and get that experience. But there's only so much you can gain from doing that sort of work. So doing a whole semester's worth of data entry and certainly anything beyond that is probably not the most efficient way to spend your time. You might not grow as much as you want to. And so I would keep that in mind when selecting what research lab you want to work in, because some research labs, that may be the vast majority or 100% of what you'd spend your time doing. So it behooves you, as someone shopping around for research labs, to find out what sort of work RAs in a given lab do so that you can kind of steer yourself towards those research lab experiences that will help give you a diverse set of useful research-related skills that will help prepare you to become a good applicant for graduate school and things like that. So that's one thing I encourage you to keep in mind, and I will mention that because we're all electronic in the Hammer Lab, we don't do any data entry. Our RAs never do any data entry like that. So I am glad that it's that way, and that's not something that I have to ask my research assistants to do because it's not necessarily the most intellectually stimulating exercise.
So those are some of the things that you would not get exposure to as in working with the Hammer Lab, so that's good to keep in mind when you're making your plans. The next thing that I want to touch on is the developmental trajectory that research assistants in the Hammer Lab could anticipate. And it may work like this to similar degrees in other research labs on campus, but you'd have to check in with other labs to see how it looks for them. So I'll just talk about how it tends to work in our lab. Typically, when an undergraduate research assistant comes in and they're new, from the start I try and get a sense of developmentally how robust their skill set is given their developmental and educational level, and I try and give projects and tasks to the research assistant that matches their developmental level. So if they're still pretty new and learning a lot of things, then we start with basic tasks and we delegate those basic things to them so that they can get their hands dirty with that and develop those skills, and then we like to slowly titrate up the difficulty and complexity of those tasks so that people can always be challenged and learn new and varied skill sets and progress along that pipeline of becoming a more and more skilled research professional. So that's one of the things we try and do in the lab. And so as I mentioned before, I can start with retrieving PDF of certain articles and then lead into organizing those in a sensible structure and then lead into summarizing some of those in an annotated bibliography and then lead into doing a research synthesis of what's been found across several articles into drafting a rough draft of an introductory section of a manuscript. So over time the tasks can get more complex. Now it's important to mention that research assistants in the Hammer Lab have a say in whether they want to take on more advanced things, because if someone just wants to kind of keep it simple and continue to do more of the same sort of complexity thing, we can accommodate them because there's always various levels of complexity of work that needs to be done associated with the projects we're doing, so we can accommodate that sort of desire. However, a lot of students, particularly those who feel particularly driven to prepare themselves for graduate school and becoming stronger and stronger candidates, they will typically want to ratchet up the complexity of the tasks that they take on. And so we will work with them to help give them more and more complex tasks over the course of their time in the lab. Now, in terms of a timeline for how this plays out, typically the first semester, if you're brand new, things will start basic, and maybe towards the end of the semester you'll bump up to level 2 sorts of complexity things if it seems like that's something, or if you say that's something of interest to you and the work that you've done already has been of good quality. Because again, not only are you learning new things and feeling the process out, but I and my fellow members of the lab are always taking mental notes on what it's like to work with our fellow colleagues and the undergraduate assistants in the lab. And we're taking note of the conscientiousness, the attention to detail, the level of quality and the timeliness of the work that our research assistants do. So we, only feel comfortable in providing students with more complex projects when they show the capacity to uh, take that next step up and they do the stuff that they've been assigned really well and they show a responsibility and a professionalism. So when they kind of put in a good faith effort and are able to do the more basic things well, then I feel comfortable letting them take on more complex and riskier and substantive things, because the more complex the topic is, the more that can go wrong or be inconvenienced when it gets messed up. So, it only makes sense, just like in businesses and institutions around the world, those people who tend to get promoted are those who have shown promise in their current roles and express a readiness to move into greater levels of complexity. So the Hammer Lab works in that way as well, as you might not be totally surprised to hear. So I think one of the positives of the Hammer Lab is that there's this room for promotion. There's this room for growth and advancement that honestly isn't always there in some research labs. I know as I went through various institutions for my different degrees, I asked around and I heard about wildly different experiences in various labs, and some don't offer that opportunity for advancement as much. You're pretty much just going to be doing most of the same stuff year in and year out. So that's what I'll say about the advancement piece. One other aspect that potential RA should know about is the the letter of recommendation aspect of things. One of the primary motivations that students can have for participating in a research lab is when you want to apply for graduate school, whether master's programs or PhD programs, and sometimes for other contexts like going into the workforce, you typically are going to need uh, your past or current supervisors to write you letters of recommendation on your behalf. And if you listen to my other material on preparing yourself to be a good graduate student, you would have heard me address this topic. So I encourage you to check that resource out if you're interested in an in-depth treatment of that. But for the purposes of this podcast, what I will say is if you are looking to prepare yourself to be able to get a strong letter of recommendation from me as the professor in charge of a research lab at a well-respected research institution, then you've come to the right place. People can get strong letters of rec from the Hammer Lab. But of course, the thing to keep in mind is that in a letter of rec, we speak very honestly to the reader of that letter our impressions of the research assistant. So it behooves people who are RAs who eventually want a good letter to do high quality work for us, because when folks do great work, then we get to talk about how awesome and professional and smart they were. But if people demonstrate a pattern of making mistakes or not being conscientious, then that's something that ethically we need to speak to when we're asked to write a letter of rec. And as you know, a lukewarm letter of rec, something that's not totally and vigorously positive and supportive of you, can be a death sentence when it comes to applying for programs, because people are very sensitive. Application committees are very sensitive to letters where it doesn't seem like the letter writer is all that excited about the person. It seems like they have some reservations about the students. So if you're going to be involved in a lab and you might want a letter that's strong and positive, you have to be ready to perform well and earn that strength of the letter. So that's something a lot of times I guess students don't think about at first, because their mind's on other things, but then later on they're like, oh shoot, I need letters and they better be strong so I can be a competitive candidate. And they're like, oh, I guess I wish I would have put a little bit more effort or initiative or responsibility into that stuff that I was doing, because now it's not as strong of a letter as it could be. So that's something to keep in mind about the letter of rec aspect. And you should know too that when you request a letter of rec, typically it works best when you've been working with the lab for at least a semester, because it's really hard to confidently speak about a student's talents if I, or the person writing the letter, hasn't spent at least several months working with you, because you need a good enough sample, a good enough exposure to a person to be able to speak to that. And we're even, when we write letters of rec and submit them through online portals for the schools you'll be applying to, we're always directly asked, how long have you known the applicant? How long did you know this RA who you worked with? So, because they're more likely to believe the good things we're saying about you when we had a chance to really get to know you through working in the context of the lab. So that's a timing thing to bear in mind as well when it comes to letters of rec. One of the remaining things I want to speak to in regards to the Hammer Lab is something I'm really proud of, which is those undergraduate research assistants who work in the Hammer Lab have access to me and the other more advanced members of the lab in terms of receiving mentoring and consultation and coaching. So not only when it comes to building your research skills and help with that, of course, but also help with answering your questions about graduate school and what sort of graduate program might be a good fit, and how do you go about applying, and how do you go about strengthening your resume and your CV, and how do you prepare to get good letters of rec from places outside of the Hammer Lab in addition to your letter from the lab, and other aspects of success in terms of getting to the graduate school level, as well as other professional development pieces like figuring out what your research interests might be long term, or how to balance work and life and family and other things like that. So other questions you have, even like what classes might be a good fit to take to help prepare you to become a stronger candidate for graduate school. So professional development and how to get into graduate school mentoring is something that the research assistants in the Hammer Lab have open access to. I'm very much committed to providing that mentoring to our RAs, because I know that when I was an RA, I so much valued getting the mentoring and the assistance from those graduate students and professors who I worked with. It's what helped me get as far as I have in that, because I had smart people looking out for me and giving me good advice, I was able to avoid a lot of those typical landmines that can stop people in their tracks as they're trying to develop professionally and get into graduate school and things like that. Because, and this is one of the reasons why I've been posting some resources online in terms of how to go about preparing for graduate school. There's oftentimes not explicit advice about how to do these things well. A lot of times it's implicit and you just kind of learn it as you go, or if you had a good mentor or guide in your life, then you might have heard about it. But if you don't, then you can be out of luck and out of the know. So that's one of the things I really like about how we're set up, is that students get good support and a sense of camaraderie and teamship by being a part of the lab. And so that's something I'm happy to
provide to folks because they, donate their time into doing great work on behalf of the research that we do, and then it makes sense to give back and reciprocate, to pay forward that mentoring and that coaching to our undergraduate RAs. So I think that's a big plus of working in our lab, and I'm not sure if you would get similar levels of personal attention at all other labs that you might consider. So that's whenever you're considering a given research lab, again, that's something you want to check in about. And if that's something, of course, that's valuable to you and something that you're wanting and needing, then it's good to know to what degree and in what form you might get that sort of coaching and mentoring with a given lab that you're considering. And switching gears a little bit, I don't think I directly addressed the how we do the collaboration and teamwork with each other in the lab. And basically, there's a lot of top-down delegation that occurs where I'll be coordinating projects and assigning roles to certain people and negotiating with folks for who does what, and then sometimes pieces that I delegate to graduate student team members, that those folks in turn will delegate down certain tasks to the undergraduate RAs who they might work with on a regular basis. So depending on the given project, we can have different setups where maybe I'm just solo working on a project, or maybe I'm working with one graduate student or a few graduate students, and maybe some of those graduate students have help from some of the undergraduate RAs. Sometimes I'm interfacing directly with the undergraduate RAs for certain pieces, or there's an undergrad RA and a grad student lab member who are working together on a certain piece, like a dissertation project that they're doing that I might be providing advising and consultation on. So the arrangement of the mini teams is very much project based. So sometimes as an RA you might work consistently with the same graduate student because there can be a nice consistency in that, and you can build rapport, and so sometimes that will be the structure. And some other times, depending on the nature of the project, certain people will hop onto certain projects, and so they'll coordinate and work together as a part of that piece. But then maybe for a different project, it may be a different arrangement of personnel from the lab. So you'll have a chance to work with different people depending on the particular projects you get involved in, and other factors in terms of what's the lab needing and things like that. One other thing I want to mention is that this won't necessarily apply to everybody, but for most undergraduate RAs who work with the lab, one of the cool things about the kind of research we do, and therefore the types of tasks that occur, is whereas for some things like meetings or certain group-based tasks, you will show up in person to a physical space, such as my office, to attend to those tasks. A lot of times the work that you're going to take on and be delegated is something that you can do on your own time wherever you want. So if it's downloading and retrieving PDFs or writing up summaries on your laptop, you can do that at 2 a.m. in the morning in your room at home in your pajamas if you want. So it's nice in that a lot of times, depending on how many hours you contract to work with the lab, whether you're getting course credit, like 395 site credit, or doing it on a volunteer basis, or if we have a grant and so we're paying like a weekly or hourly stipend or salary for certain pieces, whatever the arrangement happens to be, we will always negotiate with each and every RA how many hours per week they are going to work for a given chunk of time, usually for a given semester. And so typically if they're, say, doing let's say 2 credit hours worth of work with the lab, then that amounts to 6 hours of time on task each week on behalf of the lab. Folks who do the equivalent of 3 credit hours work for 9 hours a week in the lab. So however many hours we mutually agree to that you'll help us out with, you'll be expected to put in about that amount of hours each week during the semester. And certainly some projects will be time sensitive, and you'll be very much incentivized to attend to those in a timely fashion, or emergency things or high priority things might come up, and we'll ask you to drop the other projects and attend to that thing. But a lot of times there's flexibility with the projects, and we'll say, okay, here's this project. It'll take about 7 hours total over the course of the project. Given that you're working 5 hours a week, that'll be about a week and a half's worth of work that it'll take to get it done. So let's set a turn-in date for 2 Fridays from now, and then we'll check in and move on to the next project from there. So we'll oftentimes, after explaining the new task and giving you the tools and the training you need to do it, then we'll set a time frame and an expectation, and you'll be off to the races and working on that. And if we need to rejigger things and rearrange things or adjust or whatever, we can, but you're trusted as an adult to attend to the things that you've been delegated. And whenever something comes up and you need help, or you're not sure and you have questions or whatever, it's very much the culture of the Hammer Lab that whenever any uncertainty or question comes up, you ask. Right away, you check in with me or whoever you're working with, and you ask for clarification, because it's just not worth it to start down a path or do something in a certain way because you guess that's what was wanted, but then you end up putting in hours and hours of time, and it actually wasn't what was needed for that. And so you've kind of wasted your time, and we're now behind on the project and stuff. So it's just always better to check in and ask, and be doubly sure that you're doing things in the way that will be a good fit for what's needed. So I'll always ask. Don't worry about asking for help. We'd rather be asked for clarification than have things go down a road that we can't then get a return on that time investment that you've put into it. So suffice it to say, there's a lot of flexibility with the schedules usually, which is really nice. And it also requires folks to be responsible and conscientious and know how to manage their time and set deadlines and hold themselves accountable, and all that stuff any adult needs to be able to do. And so it's kind of cool that we give folks that flexibility to craft their own schedules and figure out their own stuff. And I think it's a definite plus, because if that sort of flexibility is something that sounds appealing to you, you got to bear in mind that certain labs will not offer that flexibility. You'll have to show up to a physical lab space at certain times on certain days and do tasks there in that space, and there's not a lot of flexibility around that. So again, when you're shopping around for research labs, take that piece into consideration, knowing to what degree it's important for you when you're thinking about what lab you might want to join. And bear in mind that for us in the Hammer Lab, there tends to be more of that time and place flexibility, and there's an honor system in terms of you getting done what you've agreed to get done. And typically we'll have some system in place, such as a shared Google document, where you and the person you're being supervised by in the lab, whether it's me or somebody else, you're able to keep each other apprised of your progress on the tasks. So like a weekly progress summary, where you will write up a few sentences about, okay, this week I worked for this many hours on that task and this task, and here's what I accomplished. And here's some things I ran into or questions I had, and then this just kind of helps us keep tabs and create a living record of all the work you've ever done for the lab, so that perhaps at the end of the semester, or a year or 2 years even from your time initially starting the lab, when it comes time to write, say, a letter of rec, we'll be able to refer back to that document and see exactly the sorts of things you did for us and how those went and your timeliness and professionalism with them. It's all nicely captured. This record is built as we go along working together. So I like this. I like that we have this system in place, because it leads to, I think, good outcomes and accountability and transparency for everyone. So those are some of the essential pieces of working in the lab as an undergraduate RA that I think is important to be aware of when thinking about whether you want to apply for a position with the lab.